Sixth tentacle from the left actually strangles Persia. The tentacle on the far right strangles China. And so Russia is presented as the imperial power which is strangling all the countries around it, Tibet, Korea, and so on. And I think the image of the strangling of Persia is an important one, because only a few years later, another American who served Iran, Morgan Schuster, will write a book called The Strangling of Persia. So the image of the strangling is an important one. In Iran, the victory was perceived also with great joy. An Iranian poet, or perhaps I should say poetasta, because his poem is really quite awful, wrote an epic by the name of Mikado Name. Now, Mikado is, as every lover of Gilbert and Sullivan knows, the title of the Japanese emperor in those days. And so this is really a Shahnameh written for Japan. The Iranian epic tradition that began with Ferdowsi continued to the middle of the 20th century. And here we have, could I have the next one too? Here we have this epic, which is about 100 pages, which celebrates the Japanese victory over the Russians. And the next one. This is what it looked like. Originally I had planned to read from it, but I'll spare you the quote. Now, the Japanese victory in 1905 triggered a chain reaction of revolutions. The first one was Russia. In Russia, dissatisfaction with the Tsarist regime was growing, and when the defeat in East Asia was added to that, a revolution broke out. The Tsar had to accept a parliament, the Duma. Inside Iran, it also had an effect, because in Iran, dissatisfaction with the absolutism of the political regime had increased very much since the late 19th century. The Shah's frequent trips to Europe had burdened the treasury. The country was bankrupt. The British and the Russians, this is Mozaffar ad-Din Shah exactly, the British and the Russians interfered in Iranian politics. The economic situation was bad. Merchants were going out of business. And modern ideas about the rule of law, about democracy, about the equality of all citizens, regardless of religion, had appeared among the educated. Now, the educated, of course, are still a tiny minority of the population. Let's not forget that. So the various strands of opposition, people who opposed the government for different reasons, united, and a revolution broke out in 1905, shortly after the Russian Revolution. And to repeat, this revolution had profound domestic causes, but it also drew inspiration from Japan and from Russia, because many Iranians had emigrated to Russia, especially the oil fields of Baku, and had become acquainted with socialist ideas through their neighborhood, through having revolutionary Russians among them. Now, this is not the place to expatiate on the revolution. But to make a long story short, by December 1906, the ruler, Mozaffar ad-Din Shah, whom we saw in the previous picture, acquiesced to a constitution. And where does Japan come in? It comes in because Japan was the only constitutional country in Asia, and Russia was the only absolute power in Europe. And so the argument went that if the only constitutional power in Asia defeats the only absolutist power in Europe, then what makes the difference in power relations is precisely having a constitution. Right? The constitutionalists hoped that this constitution would install the state of law, strengthen the state, build institutions, turn Iranians into patriots, into citizens. Why? Because only then could they stand up to the imperialists. And that was very much on their minds, because the grip of the imperialists, especially Russia, was actually tightening. So it became a desperate effort to strengthen the country against them. This constitution, the Constitutional Revolution, was celebrated around the world. Here I show you a picture of, no, please go back to the previous one. Yes. This is an article written by an American journalist, William Curtis, who was actually an expert on Latin America, but wrote this enthusiastic article, Parliamentary Democracy Comes to Persia, in 1906. So this is a type of article that Howard Baskerville may have read when he was at Princeton. Princeton, let us not forget, had Woodrow Wilson on its faculty. Woodrow Wilson propagated democracy, and Howard Baskerville was one of his students. Now, the optimism generated by the Constitution proved to be somewhat premature, because the successor of Mozaffar ad-Din Shah, who died soon after he signed the Constitution, now could I have the next image, please? Muhammad Ali Shah was nostalgic for the power of his ancestors, and did not really have, could I have the next picture? And wasn't very much in tune with the constitutionalists. And I think his absolutist tendencies are beautifully evident in the stamp, because he chose to have himself depicted on the stamp with a crown. And this really underlined his belief that the crowned head of state should be the man in charge, which was a break from previous stamps. Could I have the next one, please? Here you see his grandfather, Nasir-ud-Din Shah, who ruled for 48 years, and he is not depicted with a crown on his head. So I think even the iconography of Muhammad Ali Shah's reign shows his disdain for constitutionalism, for democracy, and so on. Meanwhile, the imperial powers continued dividing up those countries they had not conquered by the force of arms, dividing them into zones of influence. In December 1906, around the time the constitution was gathering, the constitutional movement was gathering force, Britain, France, and Italy signed a treaty to divide Ethiopia into spheres of influence. And then in 1907, Britain and Russia signed the Anglo-Russian Convention to delineate their respective spheres of influence in the areas separating their dominions in Asia. Could we have the next picture, please? Now, in Iran, this was perceived as a betrayal. Why? Because the constitutionalists had counted on British sympathy. In fact, at one point in the struggle, they had organized a sit-in in the British legation when over 10,000 Iranian activists took refuge in the British legation until their demands were met. Now, how can we explain then that Britain came to an agreement with Russia? And I think the reason was geopolitical. they wanted to include Russia in the anti-German alliance. They wanted to include Russia into the anti-German alliance, and therefore the alliance with Russia mattered much more than the political regime that Iran would have. Now, this was, of course, not uncontested in Britain because Britain had a free press. And so this cartoon from the famous magazine Punch is actually quite revealing, because if you see the last line, the Persian cat says, "I don't remember having been consulted about this." So the British and the Russian divide the Persian cat up between them, and the Persian cat says, "I can't remember having been consulted about this." And indeed, the Iranian prime minister at the time also sent a memorandum saying, "This is outrageous. They make a decision about us without actually informing us about it." Now, you see, Persia is represented as a cat. And of course, this probably is a reference to the famous Persian cat. But it's more than that. And could I have the next picture, please? Iran, it so happens, has the shape of a cat. And so the image of Iran being represented as a cat has really two sources. One is this one. The other one is the Persian cat. So, in other words, could I have image 17 now? The next image. By the end of 1907, all the rest of the world, of the Asian world, had been divided into zones of influence. The division was complete. In Southeast Asia, you see the eastern parts of Siam, close to French Indochina, were the French zone of influence. The southern parts of Thailand, close to Malaya, were the British zone of influence. Tibet, a tributary state of China, was in the British zone of influence. Oman was a British protectorate, and Afghanistan was a British protectorate. And finally, coming to Iran, you see that the Russian zone of influence includes roughly the northern third of Iran, and the British influence only the southeast of Iran. Now, many people argued, and I would agree with them, that the Russians got the better deal in this. The British zone is quite small. The neutral zone is between, and the northern zone is huge, and it includes Tehran, the capital. It includes Tabriz, the city which was by then the most cosmopolitan of Iranian cities because of the contact with the Caucasus and with the Ottoman Empire. It includes Mashhad, the country's most important religious shrine. And the British really only wanted to safeguard the borders of India. Now, what did this division of Iran into zones of influence mean practically for Iran? And here I want to quote from Lord Curzon. Lord Curzon was the former Viceroy of India, and by 1907 he was the Chancellor of the University of Oxford, and in that capacity he gave a talk in 1907 in which he defined what this zone of influence actually meant. And I will read you what he said, quote, "Protectorates shade away by imperceptible degrees into the diplomatic concept now popularly known as spheres of influence. It implies a stage at which no exterior power but one may assert itself in the territory so described." In other words, foreign powers get a monopoly in their zone of influence. I continue reading from his lecture. "The native government is as a rule left undisturbed. Indeed, its unabated sovereignty is sometimes specifically reaffirmed, and it was in the Anglo-Russian Convention." And I continue. "But commercial exploitation and political influence are regarded as the peculiar right of the interested power. No body of rules can, however, be laid down, for it is obvious that a sphere of influence in a still independent kingdom like Iran must be a very different thing from a sphere of influence among the semi-barbarous tribes of Bahr al-Ghazal or the Niger. So he says, still independent kingdom of Iran. I think that is very important because the expectation was that Iran, Thailand, Ethiopia, and all these countries one day in the not so distant future would follow the destiny of India, Algeria, Morocco, and all these other countries that had become European colonies, right? Still independent Iran. Let's divide it up and see perhaps one day southeastern Iran will be part of British India and northern Iran will be part of Russia with a little buffer state in the middle. So, as I said before, Tehran was in the Russian zone. The Russians favored absolutism in Iran. By then, the Russian Revolution had petered out, and Nicholas II had been able to reassert his absolutism in Russia. The Duma, the parliament, had become unimportant. So they also favored absolutism in Iran. And the new Shah, Muhammad Ali Shah, was also in favor of absolutism. So this brought them together. Inside Iran, many conservatives opposed the constitution and supported the Shah, who found an ally in a high-ranking cleric. Could I have the next picture? Sheikh Fazlullah Nuri, who doctrinally opposed democracy. He abhorred the equality of Muslims and non-Muslims, and he felt that if secular ideas, as embodied by the constitution and the constitutionalist conceptions of what the Iranian future should be, would in the long run weaken the hold of religion, in this case Twelver Shiism, on Iranians. And so we get then an alliance between the Russians, the conservative wing of the Shiite clergy, and the Shah. And this enabled Muhammad Ali Shah to carry out a coup d'etat with the help of Russian officers in the employ of the government. Parliament is bombarded, but the triumph isn't complete because this is the beginning of a civil war. There is resistance in many places. And one of the more important centers of resistance, perhaps the most important center of resistance, is Tabriz, the capital of the Iranian province of Azerbaijan in the northwest of the country. Now, as I said before, Tabriz was the most cosmopolitan city in Iran. It was close to the Caucasus. It was close to the Ottoman Empire. It had a large native Christian population of Armenian and Assyrians. Many Europeans lived there. Various European and American missionaries were there. A Presbyterian mission from the United States had operated a school for many years. The knowledge of foreign languages was better. And since the local language of Azerbaijan is Turkish, the Muslims in Azerbaijan had access to all the modernist literature that was coming out of the Ottoman Empire and out of the Caucasus. So, in other words, the people were acquainted with modern ideas much more than in a place like Isfahan, say, or Shiraz. Moreover, this resistance was helped and supported by revolutionaries from the Caucasus. These were of different ethnic and religious groups. We find Armenians, Georgians, Russians, Azeris, even a Bulgarian had found his way to that part of the world. These were people who had an experience of the Russian Revolution. They were also, all of these Caucasians and Iranians were in contact with the Young Turks in the neighboring Ottoman Empire, where a revolution had also broken out in 1908. So what we find is instances of revolutionary solidarity and cooperation between people of different ethnic groups and different religions spanning Russia, Iran, and the Ottoman Empire, in fact. And could I have image 20, please? This is a picture which shows you the people who defended the constitution in Tabriz. The Russians were only waiting to interfere. Their troops were mobilized on the Iranian border. And if things got out of hand, they would always have the pretext of protecting the large numbers of Europeans, Russians, who lived in Tabriz. In other words, Russian pressure grew. And can I have the next picture, please? Here we find another caricature from England, which shows Russia now sitting on the Persian cat and the British lion looking at it from afar. The lion is not necessarily happy about what he sees, the Russian preponderance, but again, the alliance with Russia took precedence over support for Iranian liberals. Russia had to be maintained in an alliance with Britain, given the escalating tensions with Germany, which ultimately, 5 years later, would lead to World War I. So Tabriz is basically the center of the resistance, and this is the city precisely in which Howard Baskerville had been teaching since late 1907 at the American Missionary School. Could I have image 22? For those of you who still haven't seen a picture of Howard Baskerville, here he is. He had been a student at Princeton, a student of Woodrow Wilson in the politics department. And given Woodrow Wilson's emphasis on constitutionalism, on democracy, he could only sympathize with those who wanted to defend the city against the royalists who were besieging. So we have a royalist army on the outskirts and the people inside the city trying to defend it. And now could I have the next image, please? Here you see the defenders of the city. Now in England, many people were outraged by the lack of governmental support for the liberals, especially the Irish. At this point, Ireland was still part of the United Kingdom. There were dozens of Irish nationalists sitting in the parliament at Westminster. They felt a sense of kinship with Iran, and they agitated for a change in British policy. One of the people who was most active, of course, in this was the famous Orientalist Edward Grenville Brown, who had lived in Iran and who is famous to this day for his 4-volume history of Persian literature. A liberal newspaper, the Manchester Guardian, which is a forerunner of the newspaper called The Guardian today, sent a reporter to Tabriz, Arthur Moore, and both Arthur Moore and Howard Baskerville actually joined constitutional forces against the wishes of the diplomats of their respective countries who didn't want them to intervene. Baskerville, as is well known, is killed in his first attempt at organizing a sortie with the Iranian students he had trained, but Arthur Moore actually survives and returns to England. Ultimately, the revolutionaries prevail. In 1909, the Shah takes refuge in the Russian legation and ultimately leaves the country and goes into exile in Russia. He makes an effort to come back, but is beaten back and again has to go back to Russia, except that in 1917, a revolution breaks out in Russia and he has to leave again and goes into a second exile, this time in Italy, and dies in 1925. Now, the people who gain control of the capital tend to be the most radical elements of the constitutional coalition. And could I have the next image, please? Ayatollah Fazlullah Nuri is hanged. He is hanged with the support of the constitutional ulama, they could find nobody to hang him. No Muslim wants to hang a leading cleric. And so one of the Caucasian Armenians, Yepram Khan, finds an Armenian fighter to actually put the noose around his neck. And this creates a lingering bitter taste in the mouths of many clerics, not all of them, I should add, because he represented only the conservative wing of the clerics, and there was also a liberal wing among the clergy who were wholeheartedly in support of the constitution. They had actually written treatises to refute Nouri's argument in favor of discrimination against non-Muslims, for instance. But to the conservative clerics, Ayatollah Nouri became a martyr, and he has been celebrated in Iran since 1979, since the Islamic Revolution. Now, could I have the next image, please? With Muhammad Ali Shah in exile, they decided to play it safe and put a child on the throne who would not have any ambitions to become an absolute ruler. And this is 11-year-old Ahmad Shah. Ahmad Shah, the son of Muhammad Ali Shah, Sultan Ahmad was his first name, was born in 1898. He becomes ruler in 1909, of course, with a regency, with regents exercising the prerogatives of the head of state under the constitution of 1906, 1907. The constitution is reinstated, and a second parliament is actually elected. The first one had been bombarded, as I said. A second parliament is elected in 1909, but this parliament then invites Morgan Schuster to come to Iran to put order into Iran's finances. Morgan Schuster does a very good job, but he goes after people who had Russian protection, and so the Russians give the Iranian government an ultimatum to get rid of Morgan Schuster. Their troops consolidate their control over northern Iran. Morgan Schuster leaves after 1911. All the north of Iran is essentially under Russian occupation. The British start being more active in the south of Iran, and that's precisely when Morgan Schuster writes his book, The Strangling of Persia, and it's a story of how this constitutional movement, which was meant to, in fact, strengthen Iran and enable it to stand up to the imperial powers in the north and the south, how this constitutional movement, in fact, is thwarted and the imperialism takes over. But Iran is a constitutional monarchy again. The reactionaries are routed. But soon after that, World War I breaks out, and to coin a phrase, all things fall apart. And this is where I will end my narrative. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Houchang, for that fantastic presentation of putting together the transnational, regional, and international forces that impacted Iran's history. And with that ending on Fazlullah Nouri, you really summarized why those actions bring the reaction that we have seen after the 79 revolution. If I recall, he was one of the clerics that Ayatollah Khomeini mentioned in his writings as not having been treated. Well, so that was a great presentation. It was very enlightening. I always learn more on different aspects of it, and I was really impressed by how the Japanese element had influenced their constitutionalists. So with that, we go to Matt Shannon and start taking questions from the audience.
Thank you.